When Mark Wahlberg stepped into the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio, he didn't walk in looking for confrontation. His agenda was simple: talk about his upcoming film, shake a few hands, maybe deliver a story or two that would draw laughter from the audience. But the unpredictable thing about live television is that a harmless joke can morph into a spark, and under the intensity of stage lights, sparks often ignite into fire. That night, what began as playful banter would slide into something far more volatile, something neither the viewers at home nor the audience in the studio would forget. The city outside buzzed with its usual Los Angeles nightlife, while inside the studio, people filled the rows of seats, clutching coffee cups and fanning themselves with glossy applause cards. Laughter echoed as the warm-up crew kept the mood alive. Above, the stage lights hovered like blazing suns, spilling a golden glow across the polished desk and plush guest chairs. Jimmy Kimmel, with his trademark grin, was already working the crowd, tossing out quips with the ease of a man who had mastered the rhythm of expectation. Backstage, Mark stood before a mirror, rolling his shoulders to shake off nerves. His stylist gave one last tug at his fitted gray jacket, ensuring the crisp white shirt beneath looked sharp. Mark exhaled deeply. He had done this 1,000 times: press junkets, talk shows, late-night banter. He knew the routine. But Jimmy had a reputation. The host was quick, sharp, and never afraid to push a guest just past the edge of comfort, if it meant landing a viral moment. 2 minutes. A stagehand called out. Mark nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. His publicist leaned close, whispering, "Keep it light, stick to the film, mention the family. That's what they love." He didn't need the reminder. He knew the playbook, but what no one in that room realized was that Jimmy had already decided to go off script. He was planning to strike a nerve, Wahlberg rarely exposed. The red light blinked. The applause sign lit up. Cameras rolled. Jimmy leaned into his desk, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Wahlberg." The studio erupted. Cheers thundered as Mark emerged from the wings, waving briefly before gripping Jimmy's hand with the firm shake of a man who had spent decades balancing charm with strength. He settled into the guest chair, posture calm, smile intact. "Jimmy, start it easy. Mark, you're looking good. Is this movie star good? Or I can still knock out anyone in this room good?" Mark chuckled, leaning back. "Bit of both, Jimmy. Always better to keep people guessing." The audience laughed. The opening beats of the interview felt smooth, practiced. But then Jimmy's grin stretched just a touch wider, and the shift was almost imperceptible. "So," Jimmy said, tilting his head, "I've been reading up on your new movie. But before we dive into explosions and car chases, let me ask, what's tougher? Filming an action sequence, or convincing people your Boston accent isn't just a really bad British impression?" The crowd roared. Mark smiled, but a flash of steel flickered in his eyes. "Honestly," he said evenly, "explaining it to you might be the hardest job I've had." More laughter followed, but this time the humor carried a sharper edge. Jimmy leaned forward, enjoying it. "Hey, I'm just messing with you. But speaking of interesting career paths, I read, once you almost became a priest. From holy water to Hollywood. That's a hell of a pivot." The audience giggled. Mark let out a measured laugh. "Well, Jimmy, let's just say this business could use a little divine intervention now and then." The response landed, but the air in the studio had changed. What had begun as a playful exchange was bending into something tauter, heavier. The audience sensed it, the unspoken tug-of-war between guest and host, and that was only the first few minutes. The commercial break came and went. The crowd clapped as cameras rolled again. Jimmy shuffled his blue cue cards, feigning casual disorganization. Mark sat with his hands loosely folded, outwardly relaxed but with the subtle stillness of a man bracing for what might come next. "So this new film of yours," Jimmy began. "Steel Horizon, explosions, car chases, the classic Wahlberg signature. But I gotta ask, do you ever look at a script and think, wow, I've basically been playing the same guy for the last 20 years? The audience laughed. Mark's jaw tensed, almost imperceptibly. He answered evenly, "I like to think I bring something new to every role. Different layers, different energy." He paused, then added, "But hey, you've been telling the same desk jokes for 20 years, too, Jimmy." The crowd gasped, then broke into thunderous laughter. Jimmy smirked, enjoying the counterpunch. "Touché, but at least my jokes don't blow up half the..." And that was the moment when the interview crossed from light-hearted, ribbing into something more combustible. Jimmy leaned back with a sly grin. "At least my jokes don't take out a whole city block." The audience laughed, but Mark didn't miss a beat. He shot back with deadpan precision, and the chuckles rolled again. Still, Jimmy wasn't finished. He leaned forward, elbows planted on the desk, voice dipping into that faux-friendly register late-night hosts use right before cutting deep. "Speaking of layers, Mark," Jimmy said, drawing it out, "you've had quite the career trajectory. Rapper, underwear model, action star, almost oh, and that colorful little chapter from your past." He paused, the smirk just sharp enough to sting. "Ever sit back and think how wild it is that Hollywood actually embraced you?" The studio air shifted instantly. The laughter thinned into murmurs. Mark didn't blink, but his eyes locked on Jimmy with the steady focus of a man who knew when he'd been challenged. You mean, do I think about how much work I've put in to turn my life around every single day? Mark's voice dropped, low, deliberate, carrying a weight that cut through the silence. Maybe you think it's a punchline, Jimmy, but I take it seriously. Jimmy raised his brows, feigning innocence. Hey, I'm just saying it's a redemption story. People love that kind of thing. Mark's smile tightened. Yeah, but usually, they don't tell it by making you the joke. The audience froze. This wasn't witty back and forth anymore. This was a stare down. The stage lights suddenly felt hotter. The cameras hummed louder. For a few long seconds, neither man moved. Then Jimmy shifted gears, throwing up his hands. In mock surrender. All right, he said, flipping a card. Let's talk family. You've got 4 kids, right? How do they feel about dad running around blowing stuff up on screen? Mark's expression softened slightly. Mostly, they roll their eyes. To them, I'm not some action hero, I'm just dad. My daughter still beats me at minigolf, and she never lets me forget it. The audience laughed, the tension easing. Jimmy smiled, but his eyes held a spark that said the fight wasn't over. So they don't think you're cool at all? He asked. Nope, Mark replied flatly. Not even close. Well, Jimmy said with a grin, at least you've still got that Boston accent to fall back on. Mark tilted his head. Here we go again. The crowd chuckled, sensing the running gag. Jimmy pushed harder. I mean, seriously, you could give the Gettysburg Address and half the country would swear you were ordering a meatball sub. The laugh was big, too big. Mark's smirk didn't reach his eyes. You know, Jimmy, he said slowly, I've worked with plenty of comedians. The great ones, they know when to stop. It was subtle, but everyone felt it. The rhythm was gone. This wasn't a scripted exchange anymore. Jimmy leaned back in his chair. Arms crossed, grin hovering between playful and defiant. You telling me to stop, Mark? He asked, smiling, but not smiling. I'm telling you, I came here to talk about my work. Mark replied evenly. Not hand you material for your next monologue. The air grew heavier. For a heartbeat, it seemed Jimmy might pivot. But then he leaned forward again, breaking the oldest rule of late-night TV. Don't poke the guest once they've bristled. So speaking of your work, Jimmy said slowly, I heard you passed on a certain superhero role. Huge franchise, giant paycheck, global spotlight. Do you ever regret that? Or was it one of those too much work, not enough ABS situations? The crowd gasped. Mark let out a short laugh. Hollow, no regrets. I don't take roles, I can't give everything. Two. It's that simple. Jimmy grinned. I get it. I've turned down jobs too. I could have hosted The Tonight Show, but I remember I like having my own show. Mark looked at him, long and hard. Then he said quietly, yeah, and I like not having to make a living by taking shots at the person sitting right in front of me. This time the laughter was uneasy, edged with nerves. The audience knew they weren't just watching a talk show anymore. They were watching 2 men circle each other like fighters waiting for the bell. By the time the cameras cut to commercial, the tension was thick enough to slice. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, calm but coiled. Jimmy shuffled his cards, flashing a half smile at his producer that said, this is getting good. In the audience, whispers rippled. They didn't know it yet, but they were already halfway through witnessing one of the most uncomfortable, unforgettable interviews of Jimmy Kimmel's career. The jokes had stopped landing, the smiles had stopped being real. And somewhere between Jimmy's smirk and Mark's unflinching stare, it became clear this wasn't just awkward television. This was the beginning of a clash. The tension from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had thickened, clinging to the room like heavy air before a storm. Jimmy leaned forward with that trademark grin. So, Mark, he said, I hear you've been spending more time back in Boston. Family, old friends, or just hiding from your last box office flop. The audience gasped. This wasn't a playful jab. It was a body shot. Mark chuckled low, deliberate. Thing about Boston, Jim, is people tell you straight to your face when they don't like you. Not with a smile in front of a studio crowd. The laugh that followed was uneasy, the kind that carried a question. Are we watching a meltdown? Jimmy shrugged, theatrically. I'm just asking what people want to know. Mark's eyes narrowed. No, you're asking what you think will trend online. That landed. Jimmy's grin faltered before snapping back into place. Well, you're welcome for the free publicity. Publicity only works if you're not making yourself look like a clown. Mark shot back. The audience erupted with a chorus of oohs. A cameraman instinctively zoomed tighter. Offstage, a producer's hand hovered over the commercial cut signal. But Jimmy wasn't backing off. He leaned in, voice dipped in mockery. You've always had this tough guy act, Mark. Funny thing is, you're getting prickly over a couple jokes. Makes me wonder if the tough guy's just for the camera. Mark didn't blink. Wonder all you want, but there's a reason I don't need cue cards to say what I think. That hit home. The crowd broke into uneven applause. Jimmy's smile stiffened, irritation flashing before he masked it again. "Hey," Jimmy said, raising his hands. "I'm just doing my job." "And I'm doing mine," Mark replied evenly. "Which, by the way, isn't sitting here as target practice for your recycled punchlines." The heat in the room rose. Jimmy shifted in his chair, weighing pivot versus push. He pushed. "All right then," he said with a grin too wide. "Let's talk about that workout routine on Instagram. The 4 a.m. wake-ups, the shakes, the punching bag. Is that discipline or just you trying to prove you've still got it?" Mark leaned in now, closing the gap between them. "Jimmy, I've been getting up early and putting in the work since before you had this desk, and I'll still be doing it when someone else is sitting here." The crowd gasped. Jimmy's eyes flicked sideways to his crew. The line had been crossed. Every laugh from the audience was strained now. Every silence stretched taut. Jimmy pressed. "Anyway, hungry for the clip. If you're so dedicated to the work, why do people say you just play the same guy in every movie?" Mark smiled thin, sharp. "People say a lot of things. Some say late-night hosts have been recycling the same monologue for 15 years. Doesn't make it true." That one detonated. Gasps, laughs, even a few cheers. Jimmy's grin stayed, but his posture tightened. He tapped his cards against the desk. "So now you're the comedian." "No," Mark said calmly, his words cutting. "I'm just not afraid to call it, like, I see it." The pause that followed wasn't silence. It was a standoff. The tension had grown thick enough to make even the veteran camera operators shift in their seats. This wasn't banter anymore, it was personal. The producers knew they had a problem, but they also knew they had television gold. As the segment inched toward commercial, Jimmy forced a laugh and redirected the topic back to Mark's film. Mark answered professionally, but the warmth was gone. When the cameras finally cut, Jimmy leaned back and muttered something under his breath. Mark's eyes narrowed, head tilting slightly. He didn't respond, not yet. Everyone in the room felt it. The real explosion was coming. For 40 minutes the tension had simmered just under the surface, but now it was about to boil over. When it did, the audience, the crew, and Jimmy himself would be caught in one of the most uncomfortable live exits in late-night history. The final segment began with Jimmy's smile stretched to wide. The kind you wear when you're determined to endure a dinner you regret attending. "Well," he said, tapping his cards, "before we wrap up, let's talk about your new movie. I mean, it's not like you came here just to insult your host." Nervous, uneven laughter trickled from the audience. Mark leaned forward, hands clasped. "I came here to talk about the work. But that's tough when you keep turning this into a roast." Jimmy tilted his head, feigning innocence. "Hey, my job's to keep things interesting." "There's interesting," Mark replied evenly, "and there's disrespectful. You've been towing that line all night, and you know it." The crowd murmured this wasn't playful anymore. Jimmy's eyes darted to the cameras. "Oh, come on. You're a tough guy, right? You can take a few shots." Mark leaned in, elbows planted on the desk. "I can take plenty. Jimmy, I've taken worse from people who actually mattered in my life. But I don't confuse taking shots with letting someone waste my time." Gasps rippled through the studio. Jimmy's jaw tightened. The playful banter had become a standoff, and someone would have to break. "All right," Jimmy said briskly, shuffling his cards. "Since we're so pressed for time, I'll make this quick. People say you're too serious. Maybe that's why folks rib you can't laugh at yourself." Mark didn't blink. "I laugh plenty. Just not at cheap shots dressed up as jokes." Jimmy leaned back, exhaling sharply. "Maybe you should stick to punching people in movies. You seem better at that." Mark smiled, faintly and unsettling. Controlled smile. "Maybe you should stick to interviewing guests you can talk over." The studio erupted shock. Applause. Cheers. Jimmy's smile evaporated. He set down his cards. "You know what? If you're that unhappy being here," Mark stood. "I am." The room froze. Cameras scrambled to track him as he rose, smoothed his jacket, and turned toward the crowd. "Thanks for coming out tonight, folks. Sorry you didn't get the show you expected." The audience exploded, some cheering, some booing, all on their feet. Jimmy stayed seated, jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched in his face. Mark strode off stage without a glance back, high-fiving a couple of stunned audience members. Along the way, Jimmy turned stiffly toward the camera. "Well, Mark Wahlberg, everybody." The applause was thin. Even the band's riff faltered, cutting short. It wasn't just a talk show spat. It was history. In the control room, producers buzzed about damage control until one voice cut through. "Don't cut that. That's going viral." And it did. By morning, the clip was everywhere. Headlines, talk radio, trending hashtags. Mark Wahlberg walks out on Jimmy Kimmel. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone picked a side. For those in the studio, though, one truth stood clear: the laughter had stopped being fun long before the exit. And when it ended with a finality that left no room for second chances. So here's the question. Who was in the right? Was Mark justified in walking out, or should he have stayed and finished the interview? Drop your thoughts in the Comments below because this debate is only just getting started. And if you want more behind the scenes breakdowns of late night's most explosive moments, hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Because if you thought this was 10s, you haven't seen what's coming next.